Hello and welcome back to Aetheral Space 8.28 World's End. We are back.
Standing here, I realize
We're back.
I am downtrodden. At this point, we are now 2 weeks ahead of the last
And you wish
chapter.
you weren't.
And I wish I wasn't, because I can't say a damn thing about all my emotions, because I don't want to spoil it for like JT or
What's wrong,
Corgo
sad boy?
or that or anyone. I know, it's so I regret this decision I made. Oh man, but we're here. You don't need a fucking recap. If you're an Aetheral Space fan, you remember what happened last time.
Real
Okay.
Aether heads remember.
Yeah, you do. So let's just.
I like how there's like 5 different nicknames for Aetheral Space fans, but it's like Dragon Slayers, Aether heads.
And we don't even have a real name for the DSCP fans. We just call them viewers. That is
Or
pretty
they.
good. That's they. Okay, come on, Darnell, let's get it together.
That's how it is.
Okay. Alright. When Atoy Musashi awoke, he was surrounded by the wounded, the dying, and the dead. It's like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but for sadness. The warehouse had been cleared of dust and rubble, rows upon rows of makeshift beds instead placed to house the casualties of the battle. Some sheets had been pulled up to cover the faces of the deceased, others merely muffled the moans of the people beneath. Musashi's sheet slipped off him as he sat up in his own sickbed, a low groan escaping his throat as he clutched his pulsing head. The memory of what had happened to him came back quickly. Ranavalona, masquerading as Marie, had attacked and nearly killed him. Luminescence had been shattered, destroyed. He quickly ran his hands over his body, searching for the sword's hilt. But nothing. He'd lost it. It felt like he'd lost a limb. This is some NTR shit. I'm not down for it. I was hoping he would, pick up all the pieces and then, you know that Japanese art where
Yeah,
it's,
I know what you
putting
mean.
gold between? Ah, man. What had happened after that? He'd been knocked into a wall. Ranavalona had begun to transform, and then he'd woken up here. Had he missed it? Had he missed the entire battle? A pang of guilt struck at him. He'd promised that he'd come back to aid Dragon Hadrian. Had circumstance made him a liar? "Are you well?" asked a droll voice from above him. He looked up. A doctor, clad all in red, was standing above him, holding a script in her hands. A surgical mask covered the bottom half of her face, but the tired light in her eyes was enough to show that she'd been doing this for a while. The words felt foggy, slow to come out of Musashi's mouth at first, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Am I well?" he repeated. "What do you mean?" "Can you stand?" the doctor said, her voice harsh. "There are people who need these beds. If you can leave, do so." Hardly the bedside manner he'd expect from a medical professional, but Musashi supposed pragmatism won over courtesy in times like these. He staggered to his feet, head spinning for a moment before he stabilized. "What happened?" he asked the doctor as she slid a finger across her script. "The battle. Tell me. Did we win?" The doctor's eyes swept over the crowd of humanity around them. "Mm-hmm," she muttered. "You won." With that, she turned to oversee the transport of another patient. Musashi stood there for a moment, knees shaking. "You won?" They spoke as if they weren't involved with the situation. Who were they? Looking around, he could see more of the red-clad doctors, making their way from patient to patient, with as much of the brusqueness as he'd just observed. Oh no, these are supremacy doctors, aren't they?
Perhaps we'll find out more.
At the back of the room, by some ramshackle tents, Musashi could see several of the doctors quietly deliberating with the turtle skirt. Were they with him, perhaps? It should be no apostrophe on that doctors. No matter. Musashi shook his head to clear the cobwebs before beginning his march out of the room. Staying here was not an option. If the situation was resolved, then investigators from the Supremacy and the UAP would no doubt be arriving before long. When that happened, it would be highly suspect for 2 special officers to be hanging around the scene. If taken the wrong way by the UAP, it could be disastrous. The best thing to do would be for Musashi to get back to his ship and fly off ahead of them. But before he could do that, he had to find his partner. Ansem Deldeaway followed the special officer with his eyes as he left the room, getting into one of the elevators. He breathed a sigh of relief as the doors closed. Good to see that one of the Supremacy's lapdogs wouldn't be sticking around. The Coalition of 3 wouldn't want anyone reporting back about their activities here, and Ansem did so dislike arranging accidents. Ideally, that swordsman would leave before seeing something sensitive. "Sir, Dr. Mordecai asked from behind his medical mask, leaning into his field of vision. "Is that all?" Anson nodded sagely. "Copy everything on Hisaya's records onto hard storage. I want to know all of Exocorp's dirty little secrets." His eyes narrowed. "And make sure to arrange that Panacea transport as we discussed." Mordecai nodded and skittered off, still tap-tapping away at his script. If he had any questions about those orders, he was dutiful enough to squash them down. Still, Elysian Fields, He couldn't help but wonder what Skipper had planned at that ghost of a planet. It's kind of fucked up that they, fought for Panacea's freedom, and then it's by the way, ship this, metric fuckload of Panacea over to another planet. You know what I mean? Very sad. Dragon leaned against the window, looking out at the desert beyond. They'd really done a number on this place. The carcass of the Panacea Walker, Skipper had insisted on the name, had decomposed back into raw Panacea, but that still meant there was a mountain of the stuff just laying there, surrounded by the corpses of the repurposed. The trail the Walker had created still lingered as well, a great indentation in the ground, not to mention the crevice that now occupied White Village's former location. The face of the planet had been charged by what they'd done here.
Changed
by what they'd done here. In more ways than one. He glanced at Pan, stood alongside him in the observation deck. She looked different from before. Ever since they'd defeated the Red Panacea, she'd seemed more substantial, somehow. More real. Like the difference between looking at a ghost and a real person, he supposed. She looked back at him. "What's wrong, dead boy? Do you have something to say?" Her grammar had improved, too. Dragon sighed, looking back at the desert. "I suppose this is it then, huh?" Pan cocked her head. "What do you mean, dead boy?" "Well," he raised an eyebrow, "you can't just stay in my head forever, you know. And I assume can't stick around.
That's some good translation there. You instantly knew what it meant to say.
"And I can't stick around here forever. It seems to me that we need to part ways." A sliver of caution ran through him. "That is something we could do, right?" Pan smiled sadly to herself, following his gaze out to the landscape. "It is something we can do, dead boy. The Panacea that's me will turn into your flesh and bone and brainy bits and stay that way. I wouldn't be there anymore." He nodded subtly. "I see." Her eyes flicked over to him again. "And that's what you want, dead boy?" "What do you mean?" "You could stay here," she said hopefully, turning to him. "We could stay together. You would be part of me, and I would be part of you. Friends." Her big orange eyes blinked, almost sparkling, and Dragon found a definite sense of guilt brewing in his gut. It wasn't bad enough that it would change his mind, though. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, but there's things that I need to do." Pan raised both her eyebrows. "Things you need to do? Things the Skipper man wants to do? There's a word. Supreme? What is the Supreme, dead boy?" "You've been looking through my memories?" "They're very loud, dead boy." Dragon sighed, planting his head against the pleasantly cool glass of the window. "Yeah, then. I promised myself I'd see that through to the end, or as close as I'm willing to get, anyway. Maybe once that's done, I can come back to visit?" He looked back at her, a faint smile on his face. It was matched by Pan's frown. "You promise, dead boy?" she growled. "Yeah," Dragon said truthfully. "I promise." Someday sounds a lot like never, Dragon. I don't know. That was all the girl needed. She nodded to herself, satisfied, her fists firmly on her hips and her nose pointed up at the sky. "You cannot resist this place, dead boy. I can see right through you." Dragon looked out at the endless sand and rubble. Yeah, really picturesque. As Dragon stepped back, Pan turned to leave, in the direction of the window. She stepped right through the glass, phasing through as if it wasn't even there, her body turning transparent as she strolled off on empty air. In the corner of his eye, Dragon saw a figure down on the bridge. "See you around!" Dragon called after Pan's fading figure. She turned to look back at him, and even with the translucency in the distance, he could make out the big grin on her face. "See you around, dead boy." I half expected her to call him Dragon. That would have been so good. And then, with the slightest breeze, she was gone. Musashi searched the tower for his partner, but she was nowhere to be found. Not in the lobby, not in the lab, not even on the roof. To be perfectly honest, at one point he'd even begin to panic. She had survived the battle, hadn't she? In the end, though, a cooler mood had prevailed. A glance through one of the windows, and there she was, sitting on the side... Oh no. Oh no. No, no, no! Sitting on the side of the massive bridge that connected the Exocorp building to the surrounding landscape, her legs limp over the sides. Musashi clicked his tongue as he hurried through the entrance, reflexively going to put his hand on a sword that was no longer there. It would take a long time to get used to the loss of luminescence. When he thought about it, he felt a dull pain in the back of his skull, like someone was slowly drilling through his brain. The warm air was as uncomfortable as ever as he stepped out of the building, and as Musashi swept his hair out of his face with a hand, he could feel that it was already moist with sweat. He strode forward, tying his dark locks back into their usual ponytail. "Officer Hazard!" he called out to her, smiling. "I see events have concluded. Are you ready to depart?" Oh no. Why did you make him ask that? What the fuck?
Oh no. Hold on, I can rewrite it. It's not too late.
she made it.
Just put JK at the end of the chapter.
Can put on the royalty-free sad
I
music
can't.
at this point of the video onward. You can find some.
Keep reading.
Marie looked up at him, a thin smile on her face. "Yeah," she said quietly. She looked different from the last time he'd seen her. White feathered wings were sprouting from her shoulders, wrapped around her body like some kind of blanket. He couldn't help but feel it was a little risky to be showing such alterations so close to the building, but he supposed any observers would naturally think her a scurrant of some kind. He stopped next to her, shielding his eyes with one hand as he looked off into the desert. That massive pile of panacea was still there, slowly sloughing away in the harsh sunlight. It would be quite the task to clear that away. "A toy?" Marie said. "Do you know where Renstan is?" Musashi thought for a second before shaking his head. "I'm afraid I don't. Is it a planet?" She nodded. "A resort world, all waterfalls and jungles. There are these jellyfish things there, big as houses, and you can swim around inside them. That's incredible, isn't it? We should go there next." Musashi smiled ruefully to himself. Maria Hazard always had her eyes on the next port. "We'll have to report back to headquarters for a debriefing first, given the circumstances," he said, cracking his neck. "But after that, well, I suppose it could be interesting." Marie continued to stare forward, her eyes distant, as if she was looking at a dream. "Jellyfish just flying through the sky," she murmured. "I mean, can you imagine? This world we live in. It's beautiful, isn't it?" Musashi frowned as he looked back down at her. This kind of talk wasn't like her at all. Was something. His eyes drifted past her wings, and finally he saw it. He saw what he should have noticed from the beginning. He saw Marie's legs, me IRL. No, I'm kidding. They were crumbling at the knees, turning gray, the dust spilling from them, slowly falling into the chasm below. Long, jagged cracks were spreading up Marie's thighs even as he looked, chunks disintegrating. Again, he reached for an absent sword. "Marie," he said urgently, his mouth dry. "What is this?" A thought occurred far too late. "Where is Ranavalona? What happened?" She looked back up at him, and her eyes were cloudy, as if she had gone blind. Her hands, flat against the surface of the bridge, began to turn gray as well. "Marie!" Musashi cried, throwing himself to the ground next to her. "What happened?" "Don't shout," Marie winced, raising her hand slightly towards her head, only for it to fall again when she couldn't summon the strength. "I took care of it, a toy." White-hot panic was slicing through his veins, squeezing at his heart, running its acrid fingers over the back of his eyes. No. This was not a thing that should be happening. When he spoke, his voice was deathly quiet, as if afraid she'd hear and answer. "Marie, what did you do?" Cracks spread across her lips. "There was only one way I could kill him, a toy, and you know I had to kill him. Or else he'd keep coming after us forever. He'd keep coming after you forever." Musashi shook his head. Fuck, it's hard to read. I have too many emotions. Musashi shook his head, his eyes wide. "No." Marie nodded. "The needle." "No!" She swayed on the spot, and Musashi lunged forward, grabbing her, but where his fingers touched, he felt matter giving way like wet sand. No matter how gentle he was destroying her. This was a sculpture on the beach, and the tide was coming in. This was not what was happening, surely not. Marie was a gene tyrant. She could adapt against this, expel it from her body with some kind of clever trick. He stared at her, eyes bulging, as if willing her to shrug the sickness away, to get up, to do something. But when she didn't, he looked up instead, head swinging around for anything that could stop this from happening. "Help!" he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "Someone help us, please!" His voice echoed uselessly through the desert. He would have gone on shouting, gone on screaming, if Marie hadn't reached up and cupped his cheek with a hand. It must have taken all her strength. He looked down at her, his teeth bared, tears streaming down his face. "It's fine," she said, a rasp entering her tone as her vocal cords deteriorated. "It's okay. I've had so much time already, Toy. This isn't so bad. I had fun, didn't you?" The wind whistled, and Musashi felt his body trembling violently. Her hand was so cold, so grainy. "Don't die," he begged. "Please just... There's nobody else." His selfish request was impossible, and it went unanswered. Her hair turned brittle, falling away in clumps, shards of Marie Hazard falling into the chasm. Musashi tracked them with his eyes. There must be something they could do. The lab upstairs, maybe. Surely Ranavalona would have concocted some way to avoid gene tyrant venom. Every delusional pathway he followed ended in a brick wall. Marie closed her eyes, her smile widening into a grin. "Don't blame yourself for this, okay, Toy?" she asked, almost as beseechingly as he had. "You're already way too serious." Her voice trailed away into nothing. The panic that had brewed inside Musashi's body escaped through his mouth. "Marie!" he screamed. Her mouth moved thrice, but no words came out. And then, as Musashi went to squeeze her tighter, to desperately keep hold, to preserve her in the here and now, with the slightest breeze, she was gone. All a toy Musashi held in his hands was cold and empty dust. The scream that erupted from his throat shamed every fear he'd ever experienced, every sorrow he'd ever suffered through. His throat was torn like sandpaper. His eyes burned like matches had been jabbed into them. And the desert answered only with his own echo. The toy Musashi stayed there for a long time, crouched down on the ground, staring at the gray dust that still coated his hands. It flaked away onto the ground even as he looked at it. Not even absence was allowed to remain. He had to get out of here. Yes, he had to get out of here. A toy Musashi needed to get back to headquarters for his debriefing. Yes, nothing else mattered. That was what he had to do. Musashi turned his head. There, standing in the entrance of the Exocorp building, looking right at him, was Dragon Hadrian. His face was pale, and his expression was shocked. It was impossible to know how long he had been there, but his eyes told the story. If only Musashi had dragged Marie to this planet Panacea to seek out this boy. If only Musashi had been abandoned by this boy on Talden, left to follow in the search of answers he was denied. If only Musashi had been shot by this boy, betrayed for his own altruism, and set on that path that ended with cold dust. If only, if only, if only! The anger and despair that had germinated within him left his body through his mouth. If only you never existed, Musashi snarled at Dragon. A shadow fell over the Cogitant's face, the result of a passing cloud. He said nothing. His shocked mouth closed, his eyes turned cold, and without another word, he stalked away. Guilt joined the odium broiling in Musashi's stomach, and he collapsed back to his knees. He knew with curious certainty that he had just done something terrible. His own weakness had led him to act disgracefully. He didn't know how long he stood there, but eventually he got up and staggered, thoughtless, into the desert, fading from view like a ghost. I have to popcorn to you because there's tears streaming down my face. I'm a mess right now.
After everything that had happened, it was strange to leave Panacea. Dragon watched the orange dust balls shrink through the viewpoint of the slipstream number 4, a morose feeling washing over him. After what he'd just seen, it was no surprise he felt disconcerted, but the feeling he got from the planet itself was unexpected. It was almost like homesickness, something left over from Pan, maybe? Whatever deal Skipper had obviously made with this coalition of 3 had come with a new ship too, it seemed. The slipstream number 4 was a boxy cargo runner, suited for smaller crews with sensitive inventory. He supposed that description suited them perfectly when it came down to it. It was much roomier than the last rust bucket anyway. Seems they were going up in the world. Hey, Dragon! Skipper poked his head through the open door, his dark hair hanging loose. Want to talk to everyone in the conference room real quick. See you in 30? Dragon raised an eyebrow. 30 minutes? 30 seconds. Come on, pick up the pace. Dragon rolled his eyes as he followed Skipper down the corridor, both of them bathed in blue by the lights built into the floor and ceiling. None of the slipstreams thus far had a conference room either. Things really were getting fancy. Ruth was already there, biting down on a cheeseburger with her boots up on the long metal table. Bruno pushes
Ruth's arc comes to an end.
Full circle.
She did it.
Bruno would push his own chair into the corner of the room, where he sat stoically, his arms crossed. Dragon couldn't help but notice the pink and kitschy game console hanging from his hip, though. Doubtless Serena had been playing it before they'd come in. Skipper cracked his shoulders as he strolled into the room, taking up position at the head of the table. Well, he said, lightly tapping his metal fingers against the furniture. I think we can all agree that was a pretty wild trip, all things considered. Dragon sat himself down next to Bruno, pulling his chair up to the table. He rested his arms against the cold metal. Any sign of North? He asked. Skipper waved a dismissive hand. He made himself scarce after the fighting was over. No way we're going to find him if he doesn't want to be found. Categorically impossible. He paused for a moment. Besides, the cops are kind of on the way, so we really got to get out of here. So what? Bruno grunted. We're just leaving empty-handed? Not empty-handed, nah. Skipper grinned. We got a hefty pile of bananas out of this whole thing. It'll come in handy when we take on the Supreme. Dragon leaned forward. And when's that happening? Skipper opened his mouth to answer, but before he did, his confident demeanour seemed to deflate somewhat. His firm shoulders sagged as his eyes took on a steep sadness. Soon, he said quietly. Real soon. We're almost at the end of our little odyssey, guys. What do you mean? Ruth asked, her face worried. She took her feet off the table. The moment passed just as quickly, and an old wide grin spread across Skipper's face. He snapped his steel fingers. Well, nothing lasts forever, we all know that. All I'm saying is that we're at the tail end of our journey here. That doesn't mean it's over yet. He slammed his hands against the table. So, everyone up to visit the final church? The navigation console had exploded shortly after Musashi left the atmosphere. The heating had started to fail shortly after that. For the moment, the temperature aboard the Arrowhead was still survivable, but that wouldn't last forever. That's why Musashi couldn't really bring himself to care. He lay there, slumped against the smoking console, staring into an absent distance. Outside the windows, the black void was visible. The engine had shut off around half an hour ago, so now the ship was just drifting at the same speed. He was in a corpse of a vessel. It seemed that the Dead Hand group had managed to get to the ship after all. Most likely they'd scavenged it for parts. He should have just checked before he'd set off. Too late now. What would become of him now in this slowly freezing tomb? Would he die here, like this? He could only muster the slightest bit of interest in the results. When he'd spoken to Dragon Hadrian, the Cogitant had said something, hadn't he? Something that now echoed through Musashi's mind like a death bell. You never know if you are happy until it's over. At the time, Musashi had just quietly accepted that sentiment, but now, mere hours later, he could fully appreciate it. He had definitely been happy, and it was certainly over.
Bitch.
On your feet.
Oh, God.
Doubtless he should stand up. He should make some effort to repair the ship, to start the engines back up. At the very least, he should stand and send out a distress signal. He should get up and stand out a distress signal, that's actually better. Take some tiny step to preserve his own life. But when he tried to muster any effort at all, the only thing that came back was the cold. On your feet! Musashi looked up. There, standing above him, was a man. A man in a traditional black and gold robe with a dark mask covering his face. Golden light glowed from his cyclopean visor. Kneeling down, he extended an open hand. On your feet, Atoy Musashi, said Nigen Rush. There is much work to be done. End of Arc 8.
I don't believe that Negan Rush is conveniently there. I think Negan Rush had something to do with Musashi's past, and this is like his mind's last will to survive. There's no way he's just there. Hasn't he been dead for a while, too? Isn't he like an older figure?
Yeah, he's dead. He's known as dead.
Yeah. Man, you made me cry. Like, I wasn't joking about that. I needed a minute. That was... I mean, he made me cry. Obviously, I'm not happy she's gone, but I think that was brilliantly fucking written. And we're about to see Musashi. He's had his whole character development arc. He's just about to turn it. Yeah, he's about to become a broken. I'm very interested to see where his journey will end. And, obviously he hit Dragon with that same line his mom hit him with. Sure, Dragon didn't seem too affected at the moment, but I think we saw what could have been the end of Aetheral Space, but now it's about to get so much dirtier at the end of this all. Oh, man. We are steering into some dark territory. And it's very interesting, but very, very sad. Before your fun fact, I'm curious, what % of the way through are we of Aetheral Space?
We are approaching the halfway point, I would say.
Really? Even though Skipper says it's almost done, there must be a fuckload in these last couple of places.
I couldn't possibly comment.
And how close are we to learning about the secrets behind Luminescence and Musashi's backstory?
I can't tell you that.
Wow. Alright, I guess give us... No fact will be fun after this chapter, but go ahead and give us a fact.
Jesus. I should have come up with
why does Negan rush why a funny cyclopean visor?
It's a protective helmet.
Yeah, but why is it only got one lens? What's the specialty behind that?
Well, it's mechanically augmented so that it sort of optimizes the view from both his eyes into a single point. That's better than what his body can naturally do, so it gives him better eyesight.
Oh, it's like some Winston shit.
Yeah.
Alright, I got you. Okay, there's your fact, you animals. I'm gonna go blow my nose a lot, and then see if I can't recover to watch some anime. I'm very sad now. I hope... Were there any points when I was reading that you couldn't hear me? Because I saw my audio levels get low at a few points. I was worried some of, when I was trying to do, them whispering might not have come through on the mic.
Heard you fine.
Okay, then it should be fine. Thank goodness. I was so worried about that. Because there's, a fine line between whispering and needing it to actually be picked up.
Well, and yet with that as well, that's the end of Arc 8, we should mention as well. So what do you think of the arc?
I thought that was an amazing arc. Probably one of the best yet. I think it's better than Arc 3. But I think it's only because you spent so many arcs building all these little pieces up. Musashi and Marie's development in Arc 6, their whole relationship throughout all the arcs. This sort of build-up between Dragon and Musashi continuing to meet and finally seeming to get along, and then both Dragon and Musashi being torn back down after finally getting over their traumas and becoming broken tenfold more. I think the way that you've worked Musashi, he's gone from being just an antagonist in the series to a very direct foil to Dragon, and I think those two are both better characters because of each other. And I'm insanely interesting to see what the total climax of their relationship will end being. Will they recover and redeem themselves? Will they be broken but better in the end? Will they have a really messy and tragic end? I'm genuinely curious what tone you want Aetheral Space to go. Because I don't feel like I can read the tone, right? Every arc and every situation has been so different that I can never tell just how far you're going to go with it. And I think that's kind of what makes Aetheral Space exciting. And yeah, that's pretty much my big thoughts on it.
Right, okay. I'm glad you liked it. I was a bit nervous. I feel like I have a bad issue with these arcs where in the middle they start to get a bit repetitive in running, just a bit more running around. That's something I want to get over with future arcs.
I do think you got better with it here because I think you're right. In the middle of an arc, there's often some running around, but I think you've gotten better at using secondary characters to sort of build off of the primary characters, if that makes sense. Let's be honest, Aetheral Space is a fuckload of characters. Not every single character named is the most in-depth, multifaceted thing ever. That's not a failure as you as a writer. That's literally
in the comments. Who's your favourite minor Aetheral Space characters? The goons I give names to for no reason.
But I feel like the goons you used, Captain Marshall, Ansem Del Deaway, although I think Ansem Del Deaway might have more importance later, I feel like you used them in ways that increased our understanding of the main cast's personalities. So, for example, I think Dragon being presumed dead gave the middle a lot of room where we were able to explore a scenario like, what does the crew look like when they're at their emotional worst? Because let's face it, yes, Ruth has suffered a lot. All the characters have, but they've always had each other, and it's still overall had a relatively positive tone. Like, even in their darkest moments, they had their friends. But this was like, what happens when you truly tear away at that core, and how do they react? And I think it left us with some interesting impressions, especially Skipper. And I feel like you almost are using that as foreshadowing to show us how fucking dark Skipper's gonna get by the time he finally executes his plan. And I'm almost wondering if Dragon won't, like, change the way he sees him when he sees that side of Skipper. And I feel like also a tiny bit of running around in Slice of Life I think is needed, because if you only have action and plot all the time, you can't get connected to the characters as much. I think it's just a fine line of not making that take too much space, which you've gotten really good at. I think Arc 3, as much as I love that arc, did have a little bit too much running around.
There was
like in retrospect,
too much going on in that security headquarters.
Well, like, looking back on it now, I can enjoy it. But as a weekly reader, I was like, come on. And I think I feel about exactly the same way as people felt about the boat arc in Berserk, where if you read through it now, it's actually pretty well paced and not that bad. But when you had to wait 20 years of hiatuses through it, and like when you're waiting through the weekly, it's like, all right, get to it. So I think that's the tricky part about a web series, because there are parts that will work just fine in their finished form, but can be frustrating in a weekly format if you don't give something. But I think you've been doing a really good job on it. I really think every arc has been pretty memorable. Even Arc 4, which I've told you I consider the least memorable, like, when I think on it, I remember most of the stuff that happened. I do think that Aether tools were a thing that should come back. You kind of, like, mentioned them once and they never came up again. I would like those to make a return. And I'm very curious if there's, like, a reveal where Musazi's sword was one, or Negan Rush has one or something. But I think you've really set up the pins for Dragon and Skipper, and for Musashi, and then for Musashi and Dragon. Whereas I feel like Ruth, Bruno, Serena, I mean, I'm not saying they're done as characters, I'm not saying they don't still have room to grow, but I feel like their major arcs have completed already. So now we're getting to the point where it's like the main characters are about to finish their arcs. And knowing Aetheral Space is such a character-driven story, that's where I see you taking it. That's where I see the culmination of Aetheral Space being. Anyway, I ended up rambling for like 12 minutes
please.
About my thoughts.
That's fine. Absolutely fine.
Yeah, hopefully you don't think, like, this guy's an idiot. He has no fucking clue what he's talking about as a writer.
In my head, I'm like, characters? What's he talking about? This is hard sci-fi.
Yeah, don't you like the stun guns? I'm thinking before the end, we're going to get one last step in Skipper's plan. We're going to get some... I think they're going to try to execute it, and I actually think they're going to fail. I think when it comes to raw power, even Skipper won't stand a chance against the Supreme. And knowing that Aether is something almost spiritual, I think there's going to be an arc where they find the true nature of Aether and who they are as people and what Aether means in this world. And then I think they're going to be able to finally defeat the Supreme in some way. That is my personal prediction for the rest of the story.
Well, no worries. We'll see how things proceed from Arc 9.
Yeah.
What's
Arc 9 going to be called? What was Arc 8 called?
Arc 8 is Panacea Arc, and Part 9 is going to be the final church arc.
I'm so ready for the final church. Alright, everybody. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you didn't get turned off by me droning on about Aetheral Space, but we'll see you all next time. Bye!